Greetings. My name is Pat Hallahan, and I'm one of the coordinators of what we are calling the Folklore Project, an attempt to capture and video significant events in the history and development of St. Clair College. Today we're going to talk about WOIT, an acronym for the Western Ontario Institute of Technology. Many of you are probably aware of this institution, but not many understand how it came to be. After World War II, consumer demand for goods increased significantly. As a result, manufacturers needed more technicians and technologists to work with engineers to optimize production. Locally, Ford Motor Company developed the Ford Trade School. Across the river, General Motors developed the General Motors Institute, and many other companies created their own in-house training programs. However, it became evident that these training facilities were expensive to run, so the companies petitioned the Ontario government to create training institutes. Thus was Ryerson created, followed by others, one of which, in Windsor, was the Western Ontario Institute of Technology. We are fortunate to have with us today two college retirees, both of whom attended WOIT, one as a teacher and the other as a student. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Art Rae and Isaac Barsky.
Hello, my name is Arthur Rae. I'm a retiree from St. Clair College's Retirees Association. And I'm here today to talk about a project that the retirees have been working on this past year to honor the 50 years of the college and the people that worked at the institution in all phases of the college. Before the college started, there was a Western Ontario Institute of Technology, and we lovingly like to call it WOIT. And both Isaac Barsky, faculty member, and myself, a former student of WOIT, we're here to talk about the early days of WOIT and what we experienced in the time spent there. Isaac, you were a faculty member at WOIT, and you joined about the same time I was leaving, and so you had a little bit of a different perspective of the place than I did. Would you like to tell us how you got there?
I was walking down the street one day, and Peter Jaffrey was walking on the other side, and he said, "You're the person..."
And Peter was one of the faculty members already at WOIT.
Yeah, he was one of the faculty members of WOIT, and he said, "We need you." I said, "What for?" He said, "We want to start an industrial engineering department." I said, "Well, that sounds interesting." He said, "Come on down this afternoon." I was on my way to Winnipeg because my wife was there. She was pregnant. We were expecting our daughter. And he said, "Come on down. Charlie Jackson will interview you." And I went down. They offered me the maximum sum of $9,000 a year.
That was a lot of dollars in those days.
Yeah.
I came to WOIT because I had tried some other fields of work before. I tried the banking profession, and to me that just wasn't it. And I really didn't know where I wanted to go in my career. And so the WOIT was mentioned in our high school, and the possibility of technology areas. And I was interested in the sciences and things of a technological nature. So I thought, well, maybe there's a place for me there if I went to WOIT. And I thought, well, which field would I want to go into? I wasn't too keen on chemical. Mechanical, sort of. My father was a master mechanic and engineer, and he might have pushed me in that direction. But I decided on the electronics because I was starting to get an interest in radio. And I thought, well, maybe if I had the background in that would help me through that. So I signed up for the electronics course, and that's where I headed. The first year, actually the first week, was quite a shock to me going there because, first of all, you notice I'm wearing a blazer and a tie and a white shirt. This was the normal wear for students. The college had the the idea that if you dressed properly, you would be looked at more professionally. And we were made to wear these blazers. A lot of us were pretty uncomfortable with them, but it got the point across that if you want to be a professional, you have to look like a professional. And it worked. It worked. And so off we went. The first week there was quite a shock to me. Back in those days, students liked to have hazing programs, and I was caught up in the middle of all that, and I just detested it. The senior students would make you do all sorts of crazy things, like they'd put shaving cream on your face to make beards out of it. They'd march you uptown to Olette Avenue and make you sing for collections and polish shoes on the sidewalk and other really weird things. I just detested that. And it was not for me. Fortunately, one person I befriended over the years saved me. Don, the maintenance man, Don Wright, he saw me in despair I think it was about 3 days into this, and I was just totally upset about all this. They'd make you wear your clothes outside in, and you know, they'd make you wear stupid signs and a whole lot of things. And he saw I was really upset about this. He says, "Come on into my office." Well, Don Wright's office was actually a desk in the boiler room. And he took me and a couple other students that you could see were really upset about this, and says, "You come and sit and talk to me about this, and just let's stay there until the bell rings for you to go to class, and we'll bypass all that." And Don was a friend of mine ever after, and Don came to the college, and he spent many years at the college as an employee, and eventually went to, I'm talking about South Campus, and eventually he went to Thames Campus and spent time there doing his work there. And he was a lay minister. And when he retired from the college, he eventually got his full ministership, and he had his own church in Dresden until he passed away a few years ago. One of my very fond memories of people I knew at the college.
I wanted to ask you whether you had any lab equipment. What were your lab equipment like?
We had all sorts of electronic gear. The electronics labs were well furnished.
Really?
I'll always remember a project that each one of us was assigned to build a module and a radio, and it was in a little box, and we had groups, like students were set off in groups, and each group had to build this one module of this radio, and eventually at the end of the course we were supposed to plug them all together, and the radio was supposed to work. Well, that was a comedy of errors. I remember our teacher telling us that that's not right, and unfortunately he pointed too close to it and got zapped, and it's, oh! And anyway, but aside from that comedy, we were well equipped with lab equipment, all the test gear we needed. That included motors to test on, electronic pieces, test oscilloscopes, etc. And so we were well appointed for that. One thing that they did get, and fortunately for me at the time, they purchased their first videotape recorder. It was a black and white Philips machine, and they let us use it on our own. And us students decided we were going to make our first TV show for the students. And we did. We spent, I think, 2 nights doing it, and we wrote the script, and we performed it, and it was the first student television show that was ever created at WOIT and St. Clair College. And the faculty let us use that equipment to get experience. And the nice thing about that was, when I eventually went out, left WOIT and went on to my career, I ended up in the broadcast television business. I had already had a little bit of experience from WOIT in television equipment. And so when I went for my job, and the station engineer asked, "Well, what do you know about television?" I was able to tell him a few things, enough that he said, "Yeah, you'll do well here," and invited me to join the company. Yeah,
maybe I can give you some perspective on what the facilities were like. This was a school, an old school. Offices were small. Mine was up in the attic. I guess I was the last faculty member hired. I was up in the attic, and I had this huge room with one little desk. As far as the mechanical and industrial engineering department was concerned, we had very little equipment. We had a fluid mechanics set up down in the basement somewhere around boilers.
That was the other room. I was trying to remember where the other room was. I knew there was another room in the basement, but I couldn't remember what it was for.
Well,
that's what it was for.
It was thermodynamics and
Yes.
Fluid mechanics. Our machine processing lab was at W.C. Lowe.
Okay.
So students had to go there at 4 o'clock, I think, on a Wednesday. And none of the faculty at WOIT were allowed to go there with the students.
Yep.
We had no idea what sort of instructions they were
There
getting.
were a few instances of that where we had to go off campus because we just didn't have the facilities.
Yeah, we had no equipment at all. And since we had to have teaching certificates, we had to be inspected. So I remember my first inspection. Peter Jaffrey, who was the head of the mechanical industrial, told me one day, inspector's going to come in. I don't know when, but you better get your lectures in order. I remember I was teaching my students how to do a time study. And when you do a time study, you have to look at the operator doing something and ask, what's he doing? Why is he doing this? You ask a bunch of questions. Suddenly the inspector arrives during this lecture, and I'm not, I tell my students how to do this, but then I start asking them questions. How would you do this? Is this the right way to do it? And so on. And anyway, I finished the lecture. A couple of days later, Peter calls me in and says, the inspector didn't like the way you're teaching. I said, why? He said, you're asking too many questions. So that's the kind of thing that used to go on at WOIT. And I remember faculty, we used to get together in the faculty room there and talk about these kind of things.
Yep.
So
Speaking about faculty were really entwined with us back then. They were really helpful when we needed help, and they were quite forthright with what we needed to know and how we needed to know it, and when we needed help, they were always available. And the faculty as a whole, to us students, gave a very confident air. They knew what they were talking about. And that was important because as one of my friends that went through WOIT and eventually went on to university studies, he said, we learned something there. It was really important. He says, I went to university after, they didn't know what they were talking about. And he says, they gave us some hard, usable skills at WOIT. And it was heartening to hear that from another student from WOIT about that. Speaking about faculty, I have some mementos of faculty that I had when I was WOIT. People that I made of note. The first one, Doug Warner, he taught math. Mr. Warner was the type that I thought should have been working for NASA. He was such a brilliant person. He used to drive us crazy actually, because he would write a big equation on the top of the board, and there would be maybe 10 steps to it, and we were supposed to find the answer. And he would write the answer at the bottom of the board, like, didn't even think about it. And like, we were all fumbling and trying to get through this big equation. And he just, there it was, you know, and it was just amazing how sharp he was with that. Al Hoffman taught us English instead of sports. And Al was an interesting person in the classroom because when he taught English, we had to make speeches, and he would grade us on the speeches, and we had to make 2 or 3 over the year to see how our progress was going. And he'd make copious notes about what we'd say, and really good feedback. But the fun part was that you'd get your mark at the end of the class, and you know, it was a B or an A minus or whatever. And sometimes you could argue for a better mark, and he'd listen to your argument, and if you thought the argument was valid, he'd up your mark. And we thought that was really something.
True, but one other thing about faculty was, you know, they were, of course, we had all kinds of people coming from all sorts of experiences in industry. And I remember some of the faculty talking about, you know, the students used to have the end of exam party. So they'd write their final exams and then they'd go out and party. And a number of faculty, I remember, would not go out with the students, mainly because they were afraid it would bias their marking.
Oh, okay. Yep,
I mean,
yep. Oh, okay.
this was
Yep.
some of the crazy things
Yeah,
that
yep.
went on. But let me tell you something about the transition
Okay.
from WOIT to St. Clair. I think this was somewhere around March 1967, and of course.
And by the way, leading up to all that, for the years that I was there, the talk was, we're going to get a new institution. We're going to get a new institution. We were waiting and waiting and really hoping that it would actually happen.
Yeah, but I think it was March or April, and Charlie Jackson, the principal, called us together and said, look, guys, you need to make a decision about what sort of benefits you're going to want to you know, keep. The colleges were going to have different medical benefits, and so we could stay with the, because we were teaching, we could stay with the Ontario
Federation of Teachers.
Federation of Teachers benefits, or go with, what's the one that St. Clair was offering?
Yeah, I don't know in the early days for faculty. Did you, Bill?
You know, what
Sun Life.
yeah. Anyway,
Can't remember in the early days.
and what you have to do is you have to make the decision this afternoon. And, you know, that was one of the major problems.
Yes, yes it was.
The interesting thing, though, the benefit of you know, going with the colleges, transition from WOIT to college. At WOIT, we had no money at all, and suddenly, when we got to St. Clair College, we had all kinds of money for equipment.
Definitely. Yep.
And Dr. Q was putting money into everything. You know?
Yes, he was. Yep.
So
If you had a good idea, he'd let you run with it. I wouldn't know how the students took the transition because unfortunately I left in '66. I just missed out the transition, so unfortunately I didn't. But we as students at WOIT felt that we were better. I remember a few of us talking about that. Oh, it'll never be the same. St. Clair will never be the same as WOIT. There's more professionalism at WOIT. And I remember that discussion. And we were very proud of our institution. You could tell by when it finally closed and they were going to tear it down, how many bricks disappeared out of the wall that people kept as mementos of the place, because we all felt close to it. I'm wearing the pin, the WOIT pin on my lapel. We all got one of these when we first went to WOIT, and we were proud of that pin. And so much so that in 1967, the year of the Expo in Montreal, I was already in the broadcast field then, and I went to Expo. And the Russian pavilion, they were making a big deal about they finally had color television. And I wanted to see that, and I wanted to see behind the scenes. And of course, Russians hold their cards pretty close to their chest. They don't want to tell you anything. And so I harangued and finally got in behind the scenes and saw the facility. And when I was coming away, there were a group of them standing around, and they were all eyeing my WOIT pin. And they all said, "Could we have that?" And there were like 3 or 4 of them, and I was really hesitant to part with my WOIT pin. And they were there with their pins that they wanted to give me. And I only had this one WOIT pin, and I was so loyal to this that I really didn't want to part with it. But I actually eventually did, because they were so courteous to me in the tour, and they had their pins that they wanted to offer me. And they showered me with their pins. I only had one to give, and I gave it to the lady that was the producer of the television show there. That's how much we felt about WOIT.
But, you know, you have to think about at WOIT, as you were saying, everybody wore jackets, ties, a white shirt and tie.
Yep.
Suddenly we were at St. Clair College, and nobody was wearing a suit and a jacket. I mean, and you have to remember, these are the 60s. And suddenly people felt a lot freer. But it's true that the quality of students suddenly went down a bit. And, you know, but I think, like you think of WOIT as being the institution of learning, and I think the quality of student at WOIT was really very good.
What are some of the more memorable characters that you?
Yes, I have a few of them in my electronics field. Mason McDonald, when he came here, he was head of the Applied Arts Department. But at WOIT, he was also a sports coach, and he was also the phys ed coach. And phys ed for us wasn't very much. We had to walk all the way over to the Y on the other side of Olette Avenue to use the facility there. And I think we got 2 hours a week there. I think it was a Friday morning we went there. We had to walk there, walk back. And we'd have calisthenics for the first half of the period. And then we would have some sort of floor sport, floor hockey, volleyball, and we would have a really good time. I remember talking to Mason after that, a few years after that, talking about that, and he says, yes, you know, he says, 2 hours a week was not enough physical activity. What could we do in that? So I felt that you should have some fun out of it while you were doing it, so that you'd like to do it. And that was his approach to it, and I thought that was really good. That was his approach. I also had one of my electronics instructors, Mr. Stannard. He was an interesting person, and he was very strict about everything, about what we did, how we did it. And so much so that I had difficulty with that, and one time I walked out of his class saying, I can't do this anymore, and I won't do this anymore. And he said, you'll lose your year. And I says, I don't care. I was a proud Scot. And so I walked out, and I did lose my year. But the irony of all this was I walked away, and 4 years later, Mr. Stannard hired me to come and work at the college, where I spent 33 years of my career at the college. And in the end, he was looking out for me, because when I came here to the college and started working, and we had a major project just after I came here, he was still intent on seeing that I went and took classes on the side to continue my education. So that's another one of the faculty that I remember. Another one, Mr. Slodkovich. I don't know how I can remember his name. Mr. Slodkovich taught drafting, engineering, drawing, and he had a really good sense of humor. We used drafting boards that tilted, and sometimes the ledges weren't up properly. We're always dropping our pencils and our T-squares on the floor, etc. And after a while, he says, "Okay, that's enough, gentlemen." And he always addressed us as gentlemen. He considered us as adults. He says, "Gentlemen, on the floor," and he had a deep European accent. And what he meant was, "Okay, enough of this. Throw all your stuff on the floor and get over with it, and then we'll get on with our work." And that really caught me. Justin McNamara, that taught in mechanical, he was very big on student activity support. And he was on the Student Government Council, and he guided a lot of the associations with his expertise. We had a lot of organizations that were tied to technical fields in all the fields, the mechanical, the chemical, the electronic, IEEE for electronics, the Chemical Institute for chemistry, and what was the Mechanical Institute, the North American Mechanical Institute?
The manufacturing engineers.
Yeah, and they all had student associations, and we were all members of it, and we all had faculty that stood in with us and helped us along with those associations.
Yeah, there was, as Art was saying, the faculty at WOIT, and I think it was the culture of the place. You know, everybody wearing suits and ties, and I think this also, affected the faculty and the kind of instructions that was going on. And, I have to tell you the story. When I was trying to put the industrial engineering program together, I had to go to Hamilton Institute of Technology, and I went to North Bay and so on to get some of the ideas that they were using, and I had to pay my own way, so college wasn't going to pay my way.
That was before I got to St. Clair.
Yeah, well, talking to some of these people, I learned that, in July, many manufacturing companies, many companies that were doing business with colleges, were offering courses for faculty, so that trying to get them up to speed with some of the new technologies in business and so on. Anyway, I came back, and at one of our faculty meetings, I suggested that maybe some of the faculty might want to do this. The end of the year, teaching year, was June, of course, the end of June, and many of these courses were on in July. And, I think faculty at the Stannard and some of the other...
Yeah, Mr. Stannard was head of faculty ed here in the early years.
They took advantage of this. They went out, and these companies would pay for you to come, for example, to Columbus, Ohio, or wherever it is. They would cover all your expenses. When we transitioned to St. Clair College, and suddenly something happened. People were saying when I suggested that a certain company had sent me a brochure about a course going on, they'd say, well, is the college going to pay us to go there? I mean, are they going to give us an extra week of holiday or whatever? So there was a definite change from WOIT to St. Clair in terms of culture as well.
Yeah. Speaking about culture, I came from Scotland originally, and we're used to different people there. But we lived out in the country when we came here, so there weren't too many nationalities living out where we did out in the country. Mostly French Canadian and English speaking. But when I went to WOIT, it was a real shock for me because it was like seeing a League of Nations of different cultures, names I could never pronounce, and people from all over the world. One of the students in my class was from Peru. Another one was from Northern Ontario, and other parts of Ontario students came. And it was quite a surprise to me to see the diversification of I shouldn't say students, but nationalities that even back then at WOIT we took in.
I, of course, had a very minimal experience at WOIT because I was only there for a short period of time, and I think WOIT, as far as I could see, was it didn't fit into the culture of the 1960s. I mean, 1960s, people were traveling, they were free, they had free expression of ideas, and they weren't afraid to put them out there.
Right.
When I first came into WOIT, I thought, what am I doing here? I mean, I had just come from wandering around the world for 3 years with a backpack, and suddenly all these people were sitting in front of me and waiting for me to tell them the gospel. So, but from what I learned, from the people who had been there for a long time, I think it was a well-run and a good institution. And you can see when they transitioned to St. Clair College, these same people really made.
They were the foundation of St. Clair.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
I leave WOIT with very good memories, even though I wasn't successful in graduating. It really helped my career, the studies I got there, and it pushed me on to get into the broadcast field and eventually my full life career. So I leave it with fond memories and good help that helped me my whole lifetime. I'm glad I went to WOIT.